Hello, welcome and thank you for joining us here for another Pharma Forum webinar. Today's session is developed in association with the National Institute of Health and Care Research, or the NIHR for short. Now, this is a second in a two-part webinar series we're running on an inside guide to unlocking clinical research in the UK. My name's Eloise McLennan. I am the deep dive editor for Pharma Forum, and I will be your moderator for today. Now, in our first session, which was streamed last week, we discussed the activities prior to the finalisation of protocols. If you did miss that session, don't worry, it is available to view on demand. We will give you that link via our Twitter stream now. You can view that at any time if you want to catch up. In today's session, however, we will be discussing activities after the protocol is finalised, specifically in terms of how placement and planning for placement can help to optimise results. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, please do get them into us. You can use the little question box below your screen now to get those in. Any of the questions for panel members, we will have a dedicated period for audience questions later on in the session. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the NIHR is funded by the UK government to improve the health and wealth of the nation through research, as well as funding research and investing in world-class research expertise and facilities. The NIHR also partners with funders of research, including the life science industry, to support and drive science and technology innovations into tangible benefits for patients and the economy. We're going to start off today with our first poll. So we're going to have two polls for you today. We'll start off one now, and then we'll come back to another poll at the end of the session. So our first question for you is, in the UK, there are a range of tools and services available to support study placement. We want to know, have you accessed this kind of support to help find the right locations for research? Now, we've got three answers for you. Yes, I always access support to identify best study locations for a study. Sometimes, but usually, it is to supplement your own site list. Or no, perfectly fine. You weren't aware the support was available. Get your questions into us now. Just a couple of housekeeping things for you. If you do have a question, as I said, do get it into us. You can also engage with our fantastic editorial team, who will be live tweeting the entire session over on our Twitter. So please use the hashtag #PPWebinar to get involved there. Now, while we're awaiting the results of the poll, I'm going to hand over the reins to our fantastic panel to introduce themselves. So Jennifer, if we start with you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yep. Hi, everybody. So I'm Dr. Jennifer Harris. I'm the Director of Research Policy at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, or ABPI for short. So I will use that acronym throughout the webinar. So we're a trade body, and we represent pharmaceutical companies that are active in the UK, both in terms of the type of R&D that they are doing, but also in terms of products that they take into market. So we do a lot of policy work and clinical research. So it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Laura, do you want to give us a little bit of an insight into you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Laura Bousfield. I have the pleasure of heading up the feasibility and startup function within the National Institute of Health and Care Research. So that means my role is to oversee the services that we provide to help plan and place research, which also includes things like our interactive costing tool, the single costing approach used across the NHS and the UK.
Matthew, over to you.
Sure, Matthew Snape, paediatrician by background, and up until September I was working at the Oxford Vaccine Group, where I was Professor of Paediatrics and Vaccinology. That's part of the University of Oxford. And I was also very involved with the NIHR, and I was an NIHR senior investigator and received both considerable funding from the NIHR to undertake research, but also support in terms of site placement and the kind of things we're going to be talking about. I now work at Moderna, where I'm Vice President for Pediatric and Maternal Vaccine Clinical Development. So being able to use some of the experience that I've had within the UK and actually now working with a pharmaceutical company, so seeing it from the other side. Thank you.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for joining us today. And Philip, finally, over to you. If you give us a bit of background about yourself and your position.
Yeah, thanks, Eloise. It's great to join everybody today. So I'm Phil Evans. I'm an academic GP by background, family physician by background, professor of primary care research here in Exeter in the UK. And I'm also Deputy Medical Director of the National Institute of Health and Care Research, the NIHR, but with the Clinical Research Network, or we'll refer to it as the CRN possibly, but the Clinical Research Network. So one of the 3 deputy medical directors, but I have special responsibility, as you might imagine, for primary care, and I lead a primary care research strategy, which is now in its 2nd year, trying to promote primary care research across the country, but also to sponsors and funders as well, both commercial and non-commercial. So it's great to be here with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. I have a feeling that primary care might come up a bit later in the session, so do keep your ears peeled for that. Now, before we start into the body of today's discussion, let's have a look back at today's first poll results. So we asked you, have you ever accessed the kind of tools and services available in the UK to help you find the right locations for research? Interestingly, only 44% of you have either used it to supplement your own site list. Only 16% said yes, you always use support to identify the best locations. And 38% said no, you weren't available. You weren't aware of the support available. Hopefully, at the end of this session, you will have a better understanding of the support available and the services that you can utilize as well. So with that in mind, let's dive into the body of today's discussion. Now, the title of today's session is all about unlocking clinical research in the UK. And I suppose the first question that comes to mind is, why? Why does clinical research need unlocking? Jennifer, if we come to you first, why? Yeah, why? Why do we need to unlock clinical research?
Thanks very much, and it's a great question to open us up with. So I think it's really clear that that clinical research brings a range of benefits to both patients in terms of that direct opportunity to access new medicines and vaccines that are being tested in clinical trials, but it also has great spillover impacts and benefits as well in terms of research active sites having better care, there's better staff retention, and also from an industry perspective, the industry clinical trials that are done in the UK brings lots of financial benefits to the NHS and the economy overall. So I think it's good that we are able to deliver clinical research in the UK, and that we should looking forward be looking to unlock and deliver more clinical research in the UK. In terms of where we are in as a bit of kind of state of the nation, it's great that UK government are acknowledging and aware of the benefits of clinical research and are supportive of delivering more of that. The UK government's life sciences vision and UK-wide vision for clinical research delivery really spells out the benefits of clinical research and where we are at the moment and the ambition we have going forward. We've seen some really fantastic progress made in terms of tackling some of the challenges in the UK at the moment. We've seen the government response to the UK clinical trial regulation published only a couple of weeks ago. We've seen a strengthened mandate for integrated care systems in England for research. So now they need to be able to promote, facilitate and report on research. We've got the National Contract Value Review work being rolled out on costing and contracting, exploring use of hub and spoke contracts. We've got NHS England issuing guidance on research for the ICSs and on diversity in research. So it's clear that there's a lot of activity underway at the moment to try and unlock clinical research in the UK and the benefits that they bring. However, it would be amiss of me to not speak to some of the challenges and barriers that we see in the UK at the moment as well. So it still remains quite challenging to set up and deliver, particularly industry clinical trials to time and target in the UK at the moment, despite the fact that we know that it brings lots of benefits. So we're seeing significant delays in regulatory approvals, capacity constraints, delaying study setup and shortening that window for recruitment. And clinical trials are still competing with frontline care as the NHS recovers post-pandemic. And what this translates to is that even though, as I keep saying, the benefits of industry clinical trials and border clinical research is acknowledged, the barriers mean that fewer participants are accessing clinical trials than perhaps they are in other countries with comparative populations and research capabilities. And as a result, you're seeing industry clinical trial activity decline in the UK. And the data that we track over every year shows that since 2017, we've seen recruitment into industry clinical trials across the NIHR CRN fall by 41%, and initiation of trials in the UK fall by 44%. And that means that despite the huge value that it brings, despite some of the efforts that we are taking forward, the UK is falling through the global ranks quite rapidly. And in phase 3 clinical trials, so that's the later stage studies, we've seen us drop from 4th to 10th place globally. So I think the value is really clear. There's progress being made. Challenges still exist, and so we need to be doing more to really unlock the full value of clinical research. So at the ABPI, we've been working with government on obviously implementation of these strategies. We work very closely with the regulators on the challenges that we're facing on approval timelines at the moment, and on the guidance that will soon come with the new clinical trial regulation. And we work really closely with the with NHS England and sites across the UKRD network and Shelford Group to make sure that we're helping take forward actions that both sites and sponsors can address to support those set-up challenges. And then last thing I want to say is that I think longer term, there is acknowledgement that from an industry clinical trial perspective, the progress that we are making at the moment needs to be able to go a bit further and faster. So we've been engaging very heavily with the Lord O'Shaughnessy review at the moment, which was commissioned by the Office for Life Sciences. And we've been laying out and sharing our thinking on what a strengthened end-to-end offer for industry needs to look like. And so today, as we talk about how we can utilise the tools and services that we have and how we can unlock that full value, I'll probably be bringing in bits of that thinking into the discussion. So I suppose that's it from me, but thank you very much.
And how much of a role does collaboration play when we're talking about unlocking?
Yeah, I mean, huge role, of course. I mean, I think it's really critical that we work collaborative, both in terms of that nationwide ecosystem, system partnership, but also at a site level as well. It's really important that both sponsors and sites are doing everything that they can and working closely together to deliver trials to time and target. So absolutely critical and lies at the heart of the approach that we take when working with stakeholders.
And you mentioned a couple of times there, we've talked about challenges a little bit. We talked about challenges quite a lot in our previous webinar on this. So we talked about challenges and activities before the protocol is finalised. So Laura, I'd like to throw this over to you. We're now talking about activities after the protocol is finalised. So can you talk us through a little bit about what those activities are and the challenges that are involved?
Absolutely. So some of our earlier support is really helping to shape and define how that research could be run, what settings maybe to put that in, which part of the health and care system that would work within, be that primary care GP practices through to hospitals or other specialist centres. That the NIHR funds a lot of this infrastructure that is embedded into those health and care systems. So the services that we provide is trying to, I suppose, drive those studies into that existing infrastructure. So how do we spread that out across the entire capacity of that system? How do we look to spread that out for participant access, but also to ensure that we are utilising all of that capability? We're helping to build that in places where that may not have been before, or how do we access capacity how do we unlock that in a location that might not necessarily be the first point that you go to? We absolutely recognise that life sciences are going to have this information already. You're going to have historical information about where to go, what relationships have worked well, what recruitment patterns you've seen or strategies have worked. What we're here to do through those services is enrich that, to complement that information and also introduce novel approaches. So thinking about things like patient identification centres or looking at decentralised trials and methods, and how would you go about navigating that? We're here to give that real-time snapshot of what is happening within the system. Now, this is all coupled with data. This is a data-driven world. Everything we do is data-driven, isn't it now? We've got apps for literally anything you want to do. There is an app that you can press and it will give you a lovely piece of information or help you watch your Uber as it's coming to pick you up. So what can we do in the research infrastructure world that can provide that same type of insight and information? The system's been running for well over 10 years now with really rich data on where research activity has happened, what type of activity, what things work well, what don't. How do we make more use of that? How do we make that more accessible? And I'm not talking data tables here. I'm talking about how we turn that into a product through these services that will help inform and make those decisions. So that's really what we're trying to do with all of our early planning and placement services, is to provide that additional insight to supplement what already exists and make the most of that complete infrastructure.
And we talked about a little bit about placement, but there's also expertise as well, because as we well know, there are experts across the country who are very, very well equipped to deliver research. So can we talk a little bit about the capacity for research across the UK and how data can help to support research in new locations?
Absolutely. So I guess with this piece, it's all around understanding what piece of information is required at a particular decision point. When we're at that point that we're making particular decisions, what key piece of information is going to help with that? Is it a case of generalized data to maybe attract new research to the UK? Is this about understanding capabilities or past performance? Or is it actually looking into softer intelligence there around, say, response times to requests, or the particular type of patient populations, or understanding how those clinics work in practice? There is so much information that we have at our fingertips that we can layer up. And I think it's that layering of information that as a collective organisation, being able to draw on parts from the health and care system, as well as information that we would hold on the research infrastructure. How do we join all of that together so that we're really helping to inform that decision with not only that quantitative, very hard data of numbers of prevalence or patient numbers, but how are we looking at, say, attrition rates or capabilities in a more granular way? How can we join all of that together to create that bespoke picture? Because every decision maker is going to want a different level of detail, and you're going to need that at different time points along that study. So I guess what I'm trying to highlight here is that we can bespoke that information. There are ways that we can ensure that the right information that you need can be provided to you at the right time by using those services, and that will then help us evolve what our offering is.
I suppose the key thought that comes to mind there is the word potential. There is so much potential in what there is to deliver. Now, this is seen quite a lot if we talk about, say, the future of clinical research strategy, or just the concept of unleashing the potential of data-enabled research. Philip, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the potential that exists and the progress that we've already made.
Yes, I think there is significant potential, and I was just going to highlight the role of primary care data in this. I mean, the data across the health system is increasingly becoming sophisticated and available for researchers to use, and to enable what I call intelligent placement, as intelligent placement of your study in the right place. But primary care data is often neglected in this area. But the primary care data we have in the UK is sort of the envy of the world, very much. The comprehensive nature of the data we have, the fact that we have cradle to grave data, we have it coded to a very high degree for everybody in the country. 99% of people in the country of the UK are registered with their GP, and their data is searchable at the push of a button. It's comprehensive, and the ability to search across GP databases has really taken off over the last few years. The ability to generate searches, to use that as the bedrock of recruitment in primary care, is a key part of the UK's offer, I think, to industry, and it's actually a key part of what we do. We're constantly refining that, making searches available. It fits very much with the model that we have in the UK of the majority of chronic disease care in the UK is provided in primary care. So, for example, if you were looking for a study in asthma or COPD or diabetes, in a large number of those conditions, the vast majority of those potential participants don't go near a hospital. They will be in primary care. And I think the question asking, where's the population that you want to access, and how can you use data to access that population more efficiently? And it is efficient because we can replicate inclusion exclusion criteria in a single database, a GP practice, push the button, generate a list of potential participants, and then contact them. The other advantage, of course, you have in that situation is you already have an existing relationship between the healthcare provider, in this case, the GP, and the potential participant. So we use that particularly in non-commercial, but also in commercial studies, to make sure that we can actually get the right patient identified with the most efficient way of doing that. And it's so important, actually, that the patient pathways, which do differ across the world, of course, the understanding of how primary care fits into those patient pathways across the NHS, which are changing and which have changed since the pandemic, understanding that and using the right data in the right place is key.
I think that really does sum everything up. It is the right data, the right placement. Matthew, I'd love to get your input on the potential of data in clinical research, given your experience. Matthew appears to have disappeared. So, Laura, I'm going to throw over to you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now. Go ahead, right. Matthew.
Okay. I double-clicked the mute. My apologies. So my experiences in recruiting to vaccine studies, so they typically involve healthy volunteers and people who are interested. So doesn't it directly draw on patient characteristics beyond age or gender? Usually we're not looking for individual conditions. But what we have done to a varying extent is use primary care as a source of advertising and promoting research studies, and using the data, actually just the demographics of people that they have on their database, and to be able to send out to all 18 to 30-year-old males or parents of 2 to 3-year-old children. They have been able to push out promotion or invitations to take part in studies, and that's been incredibly powerful and incredibly useful, even directly actually from child health computer databases. A lot of that is regional by regional, and if I send a message to the NIHR here is if we can make national approval processes for that easier, that would be a great step forward, because it can be a little bit bitsy, and the approval process can vary from site to site, but there is enormous potential there. I keep referring to the NHS-ness of the NHS, that everything is joined up, everything is linked, and that's an incredible resource. And as I say, we've primarily used that for advertising and promoting our studies. One other thing I'll say is it does lend itself to is, things like vaccine safety and effectiveness, more on an academic point of view, I guess, but you can look to see who's received which vaccines and what other conditions have they had. Has there, and so that was one easy way of determining COVID vaccine effectiveness. Who received the vaccines, who got COVID, could be determined from databases. And so there's a role there in industry in actually being able to use these things for post-licensure surveillance.
Brilliant. And Laura, coming back to you, you mentioned earlier that idea that everything is digital now, everything has data now. And we talked a little bit briefly about how data can be used in terms of placement. So you mentioned the NIHR CRN. Can you expand on that a little bit to discuss how you can find and recruit?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is. We're in an increasingly digital world. And so how do we harness the data that Phil and Matthew have spoken about there, the patient data, but also applying that with the infrastructure data and the intelligence that we have, because we need those two pieces together in order to effectively deliver our research. So as an organisation, we've been part of a multi-stakeholder piece of work termed Find, Recruit and Follow Up. But this is looking at how do we release the potential of that health data and the digital tools so that we can get wider participation across the UK. So we'll be providing effectively a wraparound service, as Matthew referred to, the connectivity of the National Health Service. How do we make sure that all of the data sets that provide some mechanism to find specific groups of patients are all easy to navigate and connect together? Because the reality is there is not at the moment one single location where you can go to for absolutely everything. There may be different service providers that offer views of that information or offer different services to perhaps do an outreach to those. So there are a variety of ways to do this. We're recognizing that this is a new area, and how can we help navigate companies that might be new to this or researchers who are new to this? How do we support them as much as possible to utilize this new way of working? Because it is nerve-wracking, isn't it, going and trying a new recruitment method for the first time. And we do want to try and make that as easy as possible and as national as we possibly can. So we are at the moment working to pilot how that approach would look, and this is about making sure everyone is armed with that knowledge and information up front. You know, we have mentioned experts earlier, Eloise. We have knowledge experts across this organisation. This is what is embedded in this research infrastructure. So how do we get you to the right people to have that conversation that's relevant to your study and that time point? Because these data sets are changing all the time. How we code things, how we display things, how we report them. So we want to be able to offer that wraparound advisory service to make that as slick and as easy as possible. And obviously try and overlay that with the research capability and capacity data that we have, so that you've got the prevalence information, you know where your patients are, but you also then know where the research capabilities and interest and capacity is at the same time. And hopefully there will be a sweet spot in the middle where those two overlay really nicely.
It's almost like establishing a kind of Google search engine where you have the confidence to know that you've got the research insights there, you've got the right placements, the right patient location, all within a single place.
Absolutely. Wouldn't that be amazing if our services could effectively be as good as those search engines and surface exactly what you want at the top of the page? Yeah, that's the dream, the digital dream.
Well, speaking of the digital dream, Jennifer, if we come over to you, I'd love to hear from an APPI standpoint as to what the services are that you are exploring at the moment, and the key offers that are available in the UK to help deliver that dream.
Absolutely. So I think it touches a bit on what's been mentioned already, but also the question that I think we've got in the chat around primary and secondary care. Obviously, I completely endorsed the work of the Data for R&D programme and the Find, Recruit, Follow-up work that Laura's just spoken to. I mean, government has put £200 million behind this, so clearly a lot of support and endorsement for that direction of travel. I think some of the key offers that we hear about from our member companies are things like NHS DigiTrials and CPRD Sprint, and both of these services are really valuable but very different services. I think the challenge there, however, is that I think whereas CPRD is primary care data, you've then got DigiTrials looking at hospital episode statistics and NHS patient registration data, and that's kind of more secondary care. But actually, in terms of that kind of future direction, we need to be seeing these primary and secondary care assets overlaid, because as much as from a vaccine perspective, as Matthew was saying, maybe the primary care data is all we need in that regard. If you're looking at a complex cancer study, for instance, your eligibility and an inclusion-exclusion criteria is going to be very specific, and you need to be able to overlay that primary and secondary and other kind of multimodal data sets to really effectively find the right patient. And for some conditions, that the timeliness of that search is going to be really critical in order to be able to recruit the patient at the right time relative to their disease progression, particularly as we move to an earlier intervention, early detection and diagnosis and treatment way of delivering care. That is going to be mirrored in the type of trials that we're doing, and so that timeliness of engaging with that data offering is going to be really critical. The other bit that I wanted to mention is genomics. So yes, there's primary and secondary care data, but actually, if you're a sponsor developing a genomic medicine, you need to have that understanding and data there. So we're really interested to see how the work on implementing the national genomic strategy is going to work going forward, because we've got increasing amount of people being tested on the genomics medicine service, but actually how they get triaged and identified and put into a clinical trial is going to be really important for for anchoring the development of new genomic medicines in the UK. This challenge around how do we have the right data ecosystem and how do we harness those assets is a proposal that we've kind of put forward as part of our future voluntary scheme negotiations with government. We think there's a huge opportunity to leverage industry's contribution to work together with system partners and government to build on what we've got at the moment and make sure that we can go further and faster in terms of harnessing data for recruitment.
I think we mentioned a couple of times there is the words primary care, and we have a bit of a primary care expert. So I think if we're talking about what primary care can offer in terms of research, I really want to get your insight into the role from a primary care perspective.
Yes, thanks, Eloise. I think the key thing from my perspective is to think of primary care. I think, to perhaps just ratcheting back to last week's webinar, just to think about primary care, perhaps at the protocol development stage, if you're thinking about how that would work in the UK. But assuming that primary care is in there, I think we just need to think about the best and most efficient way to recruit. Again, whatever your target population might be, and as it's just been exemplified, it's not every study is applicable to a primary care setting. But we get some studies that are looking at for participants in secondary care, and you can't really lift and shift that protocol into primary care. So I think early engagement is absolutely critical. In terms of placement, we've got a capacity to deliver in the UK now in commercial research, clinical industry research in a primary care setting. We've got around 3% of the GP practices, for example, in England, will be doing industry work. So that's about 200 plus practices. They will act as sites, and some of them could do actually quite complex industry work. Majority haven't got those facilities on site, imaging, pharmacy, etc. But we have a small number who can do that. But the vast majority are able and willing, and with the knowledge of their local clinical research network colleagues, can be identified as key sites for research. But of course, that's not the only way you can use primary care. Having primary care sites, and we saw some great examples in the COVID vaccine studies of primary care sites being used, and actually used sometimes in preference to secondary care sites, but breaking the mold really. And we saw some great some examples of working, for example, with patient recruitment centres, the PRCs, which we haven't mentioned earlier. But some of those primary care sites have really delivered, and we've got a few global firsts, for example, in primary care, which is great. But I think the other way that primary care can help, and it's worth remembering in that sort of menu of recruitment options, is about participant identification centres, what we PICs. How can you scale up your identification across a large population to enable a PIC referral into a hub? So this is where that hub and spoke model comes from. So usually that's from primary care into a secondary care hub, a hub that has those facilities to deliver complex trials, but nevertheless the patients are out there in the community or in primary care. So GP practices are very keen to work as pick sites, and that's a key model. Increasingly, funny enough, we're seeing picks from primary care to primary care. So again, we had some really good models of that in the pandemic for non-commercial studies. And for example, the panoramic study, which I helped to lead, one of the biggest studies of COVID-19 in the community in the world, we delivered through a referral from from a spoke practice to a hub. And we can actually search very efficiently with the governance arrangements that Matthew was alluding to. If they are in place, we can search efficiently across a very large population, hundreds of thousands of patients, for example, which would be the catchment area of a local hospital, but with a single general practice. So as long as those procedures and regulatory approvals are in place, you can do that. So I think how you're going to use primary care is really important, and where you're going to have your hub and your spokes, and where you're going to have your picks or your sites. And I think we want to increase the capability of primary care. Currently, it's running at about 10%. About 10% of all the recruits through the clinical research network for industry studies came through that small number of GP practices. So I'm working very hard in the primary care strategy to try and increase the capacity that we have in primary care to deliver those studies. Patients often prefer to go to their local practice, which well, maybe down the road, it's got parking. It's not quite as traumatic as going to hospital sometimes. So I mean, they know the doctor. So the endorsement of a trial to the patient by, as I said earlier, I think by a health professional they trust is a key part of this. So lots of different ways you can use primary care. Not every study, but if you think primary care whenever you can, is my message, Eloise. Thank you.
So the primary thought should be primary care.
The primary thought should be primary care. Yeah.
Speaking of vaccines, I think that Matthew, now would be a time for us to really pick your brains. Having worked in terms of vaccine trial placement, how important is getting the right trial in the right place? And I suppose also the follow-on question for that is, what is the impact if it's not the right place?
Well, fair enough. And obviously it depends according to what type of study you're talking about. If you're doing a phase 1 first in human study, then, there are certain units that have a lot of experience with that, and they may well be known either to the company or to the NIHR, and they will be kind of going to a key number of first in human phase 1 sites. But if you're then going into phase 2, phase 3 studies where you're looking for a broader range, or epidemiological studies to look at burden of disease or patterns of carriage, then it's a totally different story. And so one of the examples we had was a series of studies looking at the carriage in the throat of bacteria called meningococcus, causes meningitis and sepsis. And it was really important to look at how many teenagers were carrying this. And a colleague of mine, Martin Maiden in Oxford, was running this study in around 2014, 2015. And the recruitment was going okay, but not well enough. And so he really turned to the NIHR and said, we need to add sites. And actually that was transformative, because we do operate in our own bubbles sometimes. I previously been working in Oxford, and there is the triangle of Oxford, London, Cambridge, and lo and behold, we were getting sites went to the NIHR, and now we're getting sites from Preston and Wigan and all these other places that we weren't coming across otherwise, weren't, to our shame, weren't on our radar as being research capable. And so we set up, in that network, set up around 14, 15 sites. It very quickly got the 15,000 or so participants he was after. We went back to that same network 5-6 years later and actually ended up enrolling 24,000 teenagers through an NIHR network, going schools, where we were actually able to take swabs and administer vaccines. That actually was done in schools, but it was through the research capability the NIHR network identified. And that has become an ongoing network. And interestingly, it was pretty much those same sites that then were able to roll out quickly to the COVID vaccine studies. This built on itself. So in answer to your question right at the beginning of the session, do you go to the NIHR, do you go to your own sites, or do you go to a combination? For me, it was going to a combination. Yes, of course, you're going to go to your old favourites and your colleagues and people you've worked with in the past, but we needed to expand beyond that. And that's where the NIHR really came into its own, where we were able to identify new sites that we weren't familiar with, that then became your new colleagues and your new people. It was always building on itself. And that was a key reason that we were able to roll out the COVID vaccine study so quickly, because we'd just come off a study recruiting 24,000 teenagers to a vaccine study. and we're literally over a weekend able to call up everyone and say, let's get going. So that's one of the stories. Another is again a large-scale study looking at blood sampling in children to get an idea of antibodies against vaccine preventable diseases. Again, struggling a bit for recruitment, and through the NHR identifying new sites, some of which were nurse-led investigators in Bury St Edmunds in Norfolk. Again, was not familiar with the research capability there, and they were a really good recruiting site for us through a nursing principal investigator. So for us, innovative way of doing it, but worked very well. So looking at different approaches, different geographical areas. I haven't even got onto the whole England versus the devolved nations story, which again, there's an unconscious bias there, I think, that the NHR helps you reflect back on yourself that of course we should be going to Cardiff and Glasgow and Edinburgh and all these other places. And so, yeah, it increases diversity from that point of view and was incredibly useful for us in the vaccine studies. I'm now at Moderna. I'm very much speaking today on behalf of my experience of what I had beforehand, working in my previous role with the university as an academic. At Moderna, we are trying to also then be bringing as much research into the UK as possible. And I see one of my jobs now is to actually kind of bring the lessons that I've learned from being an academic researcher into pharma to be able to say, yes, we do have the NHR and we are able to work with them.
I think that's absolutely fascinating to hear how much the scope expanded when working in collaboration with the NIHR, particularly the teenagers. I think that's absolutely brilliant. But looking more in terms of key areas of support, we've heard how impactful it can be in terms of getting those patients recruited. Laura, can you expand a little bit on the other key areas of support that are available?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't think I can expand any more on Matthew's amazing story there about how to identify new sites and build that new capacity, new relationships there. That is exactly what our site identification service is designed to do. And it very specifically is a UK-wide service. So looking to expand beyond the borders of England, which the NIHR is tasked with, and this service actually transcends that, and we're talking about patient access across the UK and identifying those new to you sites or pockets of infrastructure. Now, alongside that, there are lots of other support that you can get there by building up relationships with up and coming investigators in those regions, understanding, as Phil has described there, what other areas within, beyond a traditional hospital setting are those regions available, do those regions have available to support research? So we are the Institute of Health and Social Care. So looking at beyond those traditional healthcare settings, where can we reach out into the community and other settings that Matthew mentioned, schools there? All of that is trying to be integrated into our approach for site identification, which essentially cascades the new research opportunity from an organisation out to all of those regions so that they can assess what is in their local infrastructure. And that will look different for everybody, and it will also change over time. So if one of these studies, after you talked about them being done at different times and coming back a number of years later, what has changed within those capabilities and the capacity there, not only to build on those and strengthen them. And part of this service really is about making sure that we are feeding back to those regions, because if we don't engage everybody in this collective system so that the sites that aren't selected or are continually showing an interest in taking part don't receive any feedback on where they maybe need to emphasize a particular capability or capacity, or where they need to explore doing things differently, how can we help those sites that aren't being selected to be selected next time? Because this does take effort to respond to and enthusiasm to get involved with. And when it's only one organization reaching out to these regions, you may not feel, we know how it works on a pathway, and there's never enough time, is there? There's always pushing for the next timeline. But actually, if that's happening, I think they're called micro engagements, aren't they? If that happens time and time again with, we're seeing around about 140 studies coming in through our support services every month. So if you're responding to a lot of those, that is multiple times that you maybe are feeling a bit deflated if you're not being selected or you're not receiving any feedback. So there's a lot to be said there, I think, for enhancing those services and making sure that we can keep them broadly covering the entire research infrastructure, because if that gets eroded, we then have direct contact at sites, as Matthew's described. Absolutely, we acknowledge that will happen, but how do we keep both of those activities adding value rather than one potentially replacing the other, which then puts us in danger of not finding these new locations and new settings that we could speak to. And I think some of these services as well are the way that we can highlight new ways of delivering research. Phil's described a number of different models there in previous responses. How do we bring that to the collective consciousness through these services? How do we highlight how often those are being used? And if we aren't able to do that through this network and it's direct contact, that might not have the same way of landing. And one of the other services that we do add on to that is, we can't shy away from price being something that, research costs money, doesn't it? So where can we have a look at how you can get an understanding of what the cost is in different locations around the country? We have a locational factor on our single costing model, which means the costs vary from around about ratio of 20% across the country. So how can you have a look at how that overlays on top of your site selection decisions? So we've got the data bit, but what about thinking about the cost of research in that as well? So we're trying to make sure that all of those services layer together to build up that picture and help make that decision while you're placing them.
And is that where the national contract review process comes in, to make sure that the sites that you may not necessarily know about, or as we said before, in devolved nations, is that where that comes into play, Laura?
Absolutely, because what we're trying to do, back to Matthew's point earlier about this being a national health system, we are trying to join that together in the research studies. So the national contract value review process, the principles of that is that working in conjunction with the sponsor and the lead NHS site, you define the resource that is required to deliver that study, and that is done once on behalf of the NHS, so that you can then use that defined resource to create your site-specific versions. That's how our interactive costing tool, the UK interactive costing tool, works, and that's the concept that we're trying to roll out. Now, I'm not going to shy away from this being a new process. This is also a new concept. Commercial contract research has always been sponsored to site negotiations in the past, and we are trying to change that approach and unlock the efficiencies that are within the system by doing this as a collective. So absolutely, that is the way that we want to go with that. But this also gives us such a great opportunity to highlight all of the things that Phil and Matthew have been talking about there in terms of different ways of doing things. As Jen mentioned, all the different types of data that is available, and how do we harness that within that review to say, actually, there's a different way of doing this, or it might cost this much, but actually this is what it will unlock for your timelines or your recruitment strategies or your end deliverable. There are lots of things that we can weave into that review at the beginning, and joining all of those services up together, thinking of them as a collective rather than what we have in the past as a bit of a pick and mix store where you'd come in and get something and then go out with another thing. They're very separate. We are really trying hard to integrate those so that this information builds up a strong case for working in a hopefully the most effective way, using all the different parts of the system.
That's really interesting. I do believe we have a slide. If you could just talk us through the graphic that we have available.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess this is a reflection. So we capture this information on a monthly basis. This is our overall services that we provide to life sciences on a monthly basis. But what this is showing is the study resource review, which is the national contract value review process we've just mentioned. So this happens for all commercial studies now from October, I think, on the timeline there. So you're seeing the amount of studies coming through into that system. But what we're seeing here is the value added services that we've been talking about today, so the identification of sites across the UK or the provision of clinical feedback during those early stages of protocol design are really low. The proportions compared to the number of studies that are being costed, it's that ratio that we're looking at here. So the site intelligence piece, that is notifying us of your pre-selected sites. So, as Matthew described earlier, you've got those sites that you know well and you want to work with those. So that is our notification method. But the key bit to draw attention to here is back to potential again, the potential to increase the use of those services and get more of that input in those early phases. It's a free up point of service, just like the NHS. There is no cost to doing these. It is about time planning. They do need to be, we need the time in order to gather those responses from across the UK and the sites involved. But other than time, there is no monetary cost to those. So it would be great to see that ratio look a little bit more in line with the amount of costing reviews that we do each month.
Perfect. Right, now we're going to open the floor to our fantastic audience today. We've had a couple of questions come in. So if we start, we've had a question from Stephanie Pearson, who says, coming from a primary care background as well, what can we do to increase and encourage already overworked GP surgeries to take part in research, which is a fundamental factor to delivering best care to our patients? Philip, do you want to take that one?
I think that probably should come to me, shouldn't it? Yes, absolutely. I think Stephanie's put a finger on one of the major issues. I think as we emerge from the pandemic, obviously the clinical pressures that were alluded to earlier are there. I think we're taking a sort of slow but sure route to increasing primary care capacity to deliver industry studies. I think it's challenging. I think we shouldn't shy away from that. There's lots of other things going on in primary care that detract and distract from doing industry research. But for example, we had over 51% of GP practices did non-commercial research last year in England. So although it's post-pandemic, we already have good relationships, particularly between our 15 local clinical research networks and the practices. I think making it normalizing research into clinical care is a key part of this. That's a more wider piece of work, but having industry research is part of that. But there's a number of initiatives that some of our local networks are doing. They're pairing up practices, novice practices with experienced practices, sharing equipment, sharing resource and sharing knowledge and information. So that's a key piece of work. And a number of our LCRNs are actually specifically funding some pilot practices. So these are only small numbers, but I think once they start to get some traction with industry and they can demonstrate their worth, then I think they will be moving forward. At a national level, obviously, we're advocating, as we are here, for to be thinking of primary care and trying to get extra studies, increase the number of studies, increase the number of primary care recruits engaged with research. So yeah, it's a challenge, but we are working on it, and particularly through the strategy that I'm running within the CRN.
Brilliant. And got another question come in. So where are the opportunities and quick wins in terms of improvements in the eyes of the industry? So what do companies want the UK research into the ecosystem to do differently? I suppose, Matthew, if we come to you first with that one.
That's a really interesting question. And okay, so the quick wins. I've mentioned earlier, well, I do think that there are some quick wins that we could ideally have with making more universal regulations around data access to make it easier to identify participants and reach out to them using the existing databases or using existing database to answer research questions. So I think they would be quick wins. I think the costing template that has been referred to by Laura is a quick win, because that actually can simplify to an extraordinary extent the negotiations with sites. Once you do one costing template agreed, that will apply to all NHS sites in the UK. So if you've got 15 sites, you've got one costing model. There'll be a little bit more upfront discussion about what it's going to be, what that will be, but then all sites will sign up for it. So there will not be, and having seen both sides of the coin now, I know with industry that it is a major issue of having to negotiate the same costings 20 times for 20 sites in one country. So I think that can actually be really attractive. And I'm very much speaking with my ex-university academic hat here, rather than currently Moderna. I want to make that clear. But, I can see, regardless, I think anybody can see that having to negotiate once rather than 20 times is an advantage. And that's a real strength alongside the site identification that the NHR can offer.
Okay, we are very quickly approaching the end of our session today. So I'll throw one last question out to everybody before we ask our panel the last question of the session. So we have one last poll for you, which is, does the audience see value in accessing the support, do you see value in accessing the support described today, and how likely are you to use it in future? Are you very likely? You see a clear potential for positive impact? Likely, you can see the potential for positive impact. Possibly, it's food for thought, but you're not sure how you would implement it right now. Or unlikely, because it would require significant cultural change in your organization. Please get your thoughts back into us. We'd love to know what you think. And before we go to the results of that, what is one thing that you would like the audience to take away from today's session? Jennifer, if we start with you, what's the one key note that you would like people to take away?
I think what I'd like people to take away from today is that there's clearly some best practice that sits across the UK. There's clearly some good initiatives underway that are hopefully taking us in the direction of positive change, but we've obviously still got a very long way to go. I think the challenges that industry sponsors are experiencing at the moment means that we can't be talking about change over a period of several years. We need those quick wins. We need some short-term progress to really tip us back into the balance of reliable and kind of attractive destination for industry to do trials. But that in order for us to do all of that and get there, we really do need to work collaboratively. So collaboration is key, and anybody online obviously who is keen to get involved with the ABPI and work with us on the stuff that we're doing with system partners and sites to try and shift the needle on this. Obviously open doors and always happy to engage with the system. So I suppose that would be my takeaway from today.
Collaboration is key is a great little bite-sized takeaway for today. Laura, do you want to expand on that? What would your key point be for today?
I think mine would be a practical example of how to do that. So how can you make the time to come to us early and come to us with an open mind, as been described here? There are lots of ways that we can offer to support each individual study, individual company, individual patient group. Coming with that, being curious about what we can offer, I guess. How do we make the time to be able to do that rather than following maybe a path that we've always used before? So how do we encourage that within the wider system to unlock all those benefits?
So we've got collaboration and curiosity. Phil, do you have another C word for us, or
that's
your takeaway for today?
That's a good challenge. I consider primary care, perhaps. But no, I mean, it's not just about primary care. It's actually about using data, as we've said, using the specific advantages of doing work in the UK, and that's particular, as Matthew was so rightly saying, it's about the NHS. It's about connectivity, perhaps, as another C, and that's just across the whole healthcare system. There are relatively untapped parts of primary care and secondary care that we can use, and of course, we've got a lot of experience now with things like decentralized trials that we, particularly our pandemic experience. So come to us, talk to us, as Laura's saying, and look to us for advice, and we'd be very happy to help.
I think with connection, collaboration and curiosity, we have pretty much described the entire life sciences industries. Matthew, if we can head back over to you for one last round out, what would you like attendees to take away from today?
As you say, lovely challenge here to come up with another C word, and I've got one. I think create opportunities. This feeds on itself. That if there's an investment, I was trying to think of another word for investment beginning with C, but I couldn't manage that. Create opportunities. This will build on itself. So as studies accumulate as there is an ongoing relationship with the NHR and investigators, then this actually will build on itself, but it does need a bit of upfront creativity and consideration that to make the UK a place to go, because the potential is enormous.
I think the potential is enormous is a fantastic point to end on for this session. So just before I round things out for today, let's come back to our final poll. It is very good news from the responses. So we asked you how likely you are to use support described today. We had 37% who said they were very likely. They saw clear potential for positive impact. 45% said they were they were likely. They can see the potential for positive impact. 17% said possibly, and 0% said unlikely. So I'd say that is a very, very good result for from the start of the session today. I'd love to thank all of the panel for joining us today. Thank you so much for taking your time out to spend discussing this with us. If you want to find out any more, please do use the information that we've got on the screen at the moment. We'll also make sure that this is on the PP webinar hashtag as well, so you can check it out there. If you want to review today's recording as well as the recording from the last session, they will both be made available to watch on demand whenever you like. So please do come back and visit those as and when you need. Thank you again for joining us today. I think the discussion's been absolutely fantastic myself, but I'm biased. So thank you so much. Do return and join us again for another PP webinar. Thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.